Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I wanted to give a warm welcome to Ralph, who's now online with us. Ralph is an artist, anthropologist, and politician who has been a leading architect of Vanuatu's cultural renaissance. This is not fancy words, this is true. He is a noted longtime advocate of decolonizing governance through the application and evolution of customary law, including around land rights. You've had this amazing career. You know, I don't know how you went from an artist to an activist to being Minister of Cooperatives and Business Development, Minister of Lands, Minister of Justice and Social Affairs, Minister of Lands and Natural Resources, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I think maybe coming soon, Prime Minister. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Ralph. We're eagerly awaiting to hear from you this morning. Oh, afternoon for you in Vanuatu. Welcome, warm welcome from Sabah.
Thank you, Cynthia, and hello to everybody. Yes, I'm speaking to you from Port Vila, the capital of the Republic of Vanuatu, very small country in the Southwest Pacific Ocean, an archipelago of about 80 islands. Going back in history, Vanuatu was first settled from Southeast Asia about 3,600 years ago, 3,200 years ago. People moving out from near Oceania, which is the area just off the coast of Papua New Guinea down to the Northern Solomons. People had been living there, according to the archaeologists, for 28,000 years. And then suddenly there was this push where people moved out into the rest of the Pacific, what archaeologists call remote Oceania, starting from the Southern Solomons to Vanuatu and all the way to Hawaii and New Zealand, which were finally settled about 1,000 years ago. So the interesting thing about this, seeing I'm talking to a lot of you in Borneo, is that when you leave Southeast Asia and you go out the furthest you can from the previous island you've come from, you see the next one in front of you before you lose sight of the one behind you. But it's only when you get down to the mid-Solomons, that's a very significant sort of breaking point where you can go out and lose sight of the island behind you and you can't see the island in front of you. And that was the break in human settlement for 20,000 years. People never got beyond that point. So there was some sort of development in technology of canoes, seafaring, sailing vessels, and maybe human imagination, which got us to push out. And so our societies evolved and diversified, and we ended up in what is called Melanesia by the anthropologists. Melanesia means the Black Islands. Basically all of the island of New Guinea, including the Indonesian province of Papua, Papua New Guinea, coming down to the Solomon Islands, to Vanuatu, to New Caledonia, which is still a colony of France, out to Fiji. This is what is called Melanesia. And Melanesia is characterized as having the highest number of indigenous languages in the world for the population. So the total population is probably around 7 to 8 to 9 million in all those countries put together, including the territory of the province of Papua, or what we call West Papua, the self-determined nation of West Papua. So you have the most languages per population of any area in the world. And also an interesting thing was when these nations became independent, so that's Papua New Guinea, Solomons, Vanuatu, between the period 1975 to 1980, Papua New Guinea became independent in 1975. Solomon Islands in 1977, Vanuatu in 1980. We still have a process of decolonization going on in Bougainville, which is an island province of Papua New Guinea, which went through a long civil war. And now they're entered into a decolonization process. Same as New Caledonia is now in a decolonization process with France. West Papua hasn't got that far yet. They're still fighting. When we became independent, an interesting thing was probably the most significant feature of political independence from the colonizers, which was usually Britain in the case of New Caledonia, sorry, Britain in the case of Solomon Islands, Britain and France together in the case of Vanuatu, Australia in the case of Papua New Guinea. Our constitutions upon independence basically said all the land goes back under the control of indigenous law, customary law to the indigenous people. So in various forms, in Vanuatu, for example, 100% of the land went back. And it was just a few phrases in the National Constitution that said, all the land goes back under customary ownership. It can only be owned in perpetuity by the traditional owners, and it has to be owned according to customary law. And that was definitely the most significant aspect of political independence. The rest of it, we kind of inherited the Western bureaucracy model from UK. Our government is a Western democratic parliamentary system, Westminster system, elected members of parliament like myself, prime minister, cabinet ministers. We've got a Western style bureaucracy, Western style development. But that was the key thing, was the return of the land. And that came out of a history of alienation of land under the colonial regime. Like all indigenous people everywhere in the world, Vanuatu went through a period of massive depopulation. We went from an estimated population of around probably, the archaeologists say 800,000 to 1 million people in the 80 islands that make up Vanuatu, pre-European contact, to a low point around the period between the First World War and the Second World War of less than 40,000 people in the whole country. And now we're coming back up, and the last census was done 2 years ago. And last year, we're back up to just over 300,000 people. It's a very small country. We're only a country through the colonial borders that were drawn between Solomons and the New Hebrides, what Vanuatu used to be called, and Hebrides and New Caledonia. So in that area, over 100 different cultures with their own languages. So the colonial history is what has given us a unified state. And even that was contested at the time of independence. There was a secession movement in the north of the country. It went on for a few months just prior to independence and was immediately kind of quelled by soon after independence. So a very young state, an indigenous state in that 90% of the people are indigenous people coming from the land, and indigenous people run the government and everything. So it's like an indigenous state. But once you get past political independence, then you come up to the next need for emancipation, and you realize that being indigenous having indigenous people in control is not the end. It's then you deal with all the other issues. So from that base, we are now in our 41st year of political independence. I kind of came on my father and my mother were instrumental in the self-determination movement in the 1970s. I was growing up in Port Vila, where I'm speaking from now. I was going to primary school. So I saw a bit of that, came from that legacy. We became independent. And I was interested in cultural heritage. I studied that. We have to go to university. When I was doing university, there was no university in Vanuatu. We had to go overseas. The regional university is the University of the South Pacific, owned by 14 Pacific Island nations. Headquarters in Fiji. So I came back to Vanuatu in the early 90s with a development studies degree, anthropology degree. So was trained in the Western way to look at development through a cultural lens. Immediately began working in the premier, the National Cultural Heritage Institution, which is the Vanuatu Cultural Centre. And my first job was going around the country recording cultural sites. We have no literary tradition in Vanuatu. It's all oral. So it is the first time many of these sites are being put on a map. The stories about them I was recording from the elders, and those stories are being recorded, put in the archive, taking photos of the sites. So basically preserving the knowledge at the same time, protecting the site. If in future there was some development, we could have a database of where all the cultural sites were that needed to be considered. And then I quickly moved on to becoming, as you do, you tend to be promoted and then you become a manager rather than doing anything you really want to do in the field. So I became a manager of the institution. And so managing a lot of work essentially around preserving and promoting our cultural heritage. That was our mandate under law. The preservation, promotion, maintenance of the cultural heritage of the cultures of Vanuatu. Doing that through the institutions of a national museum, a national film and sound archive, national library, national cultural sites register. I became overall manager of all of that. And so we're doing a lot of work working with communities. We have a very renowned model in Vanuatu where men and women from each of the cultural groups are chosen to be representatives of those groups, and they basically manage everything to do with the management of the cultural heritage of that community. They advise on, when cultural events are happening that should be supported and should be recorded. They advise on when we do cultural site surveys. They advise on what the community's priorities for preservation of their cultural heritage is, or safeguarding of elements of their cultural heritage. They basically advise what we can and cannot do in terms of what the community wants for the maintenance of their cultural heritage. And so they are basically our advisors. And as well, a lot of them receive training in basic fieldwork documentation techniques. As the Vanuatu's cultures in UNESCO terminology, intangible cultural heritage, that's what applies in Vanuatu. I was involved in the development of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention because I came from that background of knowing that's exactly what we were doing. It was all about safeguarding intangible cultural heritage, which means safeguarding ways of living, finding ways to facilitate people to live using aspects of their traditional cultural heritage. So we did that. We were doing that as a section of the state, a part of a state that was basically a capitalist state engaged in the development project. So lots of contradictions in how the government was, having us doing this work, funding us at the same time, doing a lot of other stuff that was totally destroying the indigenous cultures, or not paying no heed to them or not using them as the basis for development. A lot of this came to a head when we had a structural adjustment program in 1987 that came in, the typical World Bank structural adjustment program, except this time it was the ADB, Asian Development Bank, that was the key agent, saying, okay, you have to pare back your civil service, sack a lot of, get rid of a lot of public services, promote foreign investment, free up land so that foreign investors can come in and invest, and that'll be the future development of your economy. At that time, large-scale leasing of customary land started to be engaged in. And remember, I said at the beginning that our constitution enshrines indigenous custom ownership of customary land according to customary law. Well, Parliament very soon after independence passed laws allowing the leasing of customary land by the custom owners for development purposes. But those laws began to be abused according to what the constitution laid out. So you couldn't, basically you got a stage where the minister, a single individual person, was able to sign a lease over a large tract of customary land, leasing it without the free, prior, informed consent of the customary owners, the indigenous customary owners. And that power started to be abused on a massive scale. And so we were seeing large tracts being just gone. Because most of the land, the custom ownership is not determined at this point in time in Vanuatu still, after 40 years. It's a lot of land under traditional disputes. And that doesn't stop the use of the land in the traditional economy. In the traditional economy, you can continue to use this land for sustaining your life. Food gardens, everything that you need is not disturbed by it being undetermined according to Western criteria of having an owner or an owning clan. So in those cases, the law had a loophole allowing the Minister of Land to act on behalf of the traditional owners to lease land. And basically supposed to consult, but obviously no consultation, none, blah, blah, blah. So I see a lot of you nodding, so you know the situation. And so we got to the stage by the year 2000, the early 2000s, where we were a small state cultural institution trying to preserve the cultural heritage of the people, safeguard the traditional ways of life that depended on the land. And on the other side, the government massively leasing out land without the prior informed consent of the customary owners, destroying any possible basis for safeguarding of indigenous culture. So we began a series of policy measures to try and address this. We went out, held workshops in the community saying, look, what do we need to do? We talked about the need to ensure that there was traditional wealth items produced in insufficient quantity to allow the traditional ceremonies to be practiced so that those things can be kept alive. Because without the traditional ceremonies happening, a lot of knowledge is being lost. So we need to build up, make sure that the land produces the resources, the traditional wealth items that are needed to sustain aspects of traditional cultural heritage that are most important for transmission of traditional knowledge in the face of these traditional wealth items not being cash crops. So while the government was promoting cash crops, it was using the land for, cocoa, coffee, coconuts, stuff that was peripheral to the traditional economy. And so trying to make sure that we refocused on getting the land to produce the traditional wealth items we needed to sustain traditional economy. And then necessarily as part of all that, people were saying, look, well, we've got to stop the government leasing our land because that's removing a whole huge amount of land out of the equation that we can use to balance between cash cropping and having enough land for sustaining our traditional wealth items. So the resolution came, we've got to stop leasing land. Okay, so as the head of the institution, we liaised with the Ministry of Lands, organized a national consultation on how are we going to address the situation? What is the problem? How do we address it? Ended up with, after a series of nationwide provincial land summits, we had one national land summit in 2006, came up with resolutions, and this whole process was now under the governance of the Traditional Council of Chiefs. So in our constitution, as part of becoming independent, we established the Traditional Council of Chiefs. So this is a traditional council, no power. All it had was, it existed and had advisory power towards the government, but no actual power. And that is something we're still working on addressing. So the National Council of Chiefs received these resolutions, the 20 resolutions of the 2006 Land Summit, how we can stop this leasing without the free, prior, informed consent of traditional owners in the spirit of the 1980 Constitution we became independent with. So that was handed over duly by the chiefs to the government. The Minister of Lands received it. The government said, yes, we will address it. And then nothing happened. 2007 went by, nothing happened. 2008. So we basically reached the peak of policymaking as public servants, as civil servants, what we could do. And we're just waiting for the politicians to act, which is we got it through all the levels of the bureaucracy to the final level, which was, you just got to address it in Parliament through the changes in the laws. And that didn't happen. And one of the reasons was ministers of lands were making so much money getting bribed to sign these leases. So it was the corruption that was preventing it happening. No one wanted to, the Minister of Lands didn't want to table this bill because immediately he loses access to his automatic teller machine, which was the ability to give leases to anybody just by himself. So when we saw that, we had a general election coming up in 2008, and there was a decision that I was going to contest that election, and we get up to that next level where we could make that change in Parliament. We got to the level below Parliament. We'd done everything possible, and it wasn't happening. It wasn't changing up at that level. So the decision was made, we've got to get in there, and they decided to run me as an independent candidate on that, basically on that ticket. It was on the ticket of stopping the leasing, returning land to the control of Indigenous custom owners, as was in the Constitution, which meant dealing with corruption. You've got to stop corruption, otherwise you won't stop this as well. So there's two aspects to it. So I won by a landslide as an independent candidate, but it was me as an individual alongside all these major parties that existed, 52 member legislature. I was one person. So I got in a lot of trouble. Tried to make changes I couldn't. I got told to apologize to other members in Parliament who I was kicked out of Parliament for a session. And so recognizing the realities of democratic Parliament, Western democratic system, we formed a party in 2010, Land and Justice Party, contested the next election in 2012. We have 4-year cycles. I got in with 3 other people in my party, so now 4. And in Vanuatu's very fragmented political system, a party of 4 is a party that can leverage, right? So we managed to leverage to the point where in 2013, we managed to get into government with one condition, land reform. I become the Minister of Lands and we do the land reform that we've been talking about. And so we had enough leverage as a minor party holding together a coalition of many parties that we could demand that, and I got that ministry. And then within a year, we did all the consultations around the country and worked with the lawyers. And by the end of 2013, we passed our land reform, which was basically stripping the power of the Minister of Lands away, no more powers at all to do anything. Inscribing free, prior informed consent of the Indigenous custom owners to any leasing of their land, which is now the way it operates. We even managed to change the Constitution, which required a vote of 2/3 of members of Parliament. We changed the Constitution to remove the jurisdiction of Western courts to determine ownership of customary land. And ownership of customary land could only be determined now according to customary law. And we had to change the Constitution to do that because the Constitution allowed for the Supreme Court to be the final arbiter of justice in the whole country. And the communities and the the customary authorities didn't want that. They say, look, our customary law should be superior to Western law. And so we managed to do that by changing the Constitution, that one change. Now, Western courts can no longer determine who is the owner of customary land. It has to be determined according to customary law. But we still had to put that whole process, we had to create a space in the Western law for the customary system to operate in a way that didn't violate natural justice. Because you have to remember, as we all know, that even in the customary law system, there is corruption, especially in the context of the modern day life we're living in. So make sure that we allowed customary law to operate, but made sure that members of the community, of that Indigenous community, had access to natural justice, but not through Western courts, but through using that system and getting. I suppose I'll explain it this way to say that decisions made by the customary authority could be quashed if you could, you go up to the next level, which is the Council of Chiefs of the customary area, because the decisions are made at what we call nakamals, which are meeting places, traditional meeting place, which exists in all our different cultures in different forms. But there's a generic term in the Pidgin English we now use nationally to link all the cultures. That's how we speak to each other, because we all have different languages, so we can't understand each other, but we use a lingua franca called Pidgin English, Bislama. And in Bislama, they call these places nakamals, and that's the terminology we use in the law. And when the nakamal, there's an accusation of corrupt decision-making by a chief or a group of chiefs, it goes up to the area council of chiefs, which is the council of chiefs representing all the Nakamals in that custom area. So it's still the same traditional knowledge set of, it's still the same customary law. And they can quash the decision of the Nakamal and say, do it again. But you can't come out of that customary law into the Western law jurisdiction. So that was all that, this balancing act, trying to make sure that we set up a system that did not result in people who were not the traditional owners of the land not making free, prior, informed consent to lease their land. So that system has been complicated to run and manage, but the effect has been leasing has stopped, which is what we intended. There's a big political push against us right now because, of course, many of the other parties wanted to recommence so that they can start making their money again. But we're holding the fort so far, even in opposition, because the people are with us. And I'm now the leader of the opposition since over a year now, since the last election. And the new government tried to bring in changes earlier this year. And the Council of Chiefs and everyone wrote to them and said, no, do not change this. And so they withdrew the bill. So that was good to get that support there in the civil society, even without the political, us being in power. Okay, so that's the land bit. And then the other bit was we had to, in terms of getting land used for producing traditional wealth items as opposed to cash crops, using the land to sustain traditional economies as opposed to leasing it to sustain a capitalist economy, you have to change the value that's put on the land. And that was another big project we did to develop what we called initially Melanesian indicators of well-being. We started that process with focus groups, in the same way we do everything, go in the communities, work with people and say, look, what's important to you from your land and everything? What are the important things in your life? And as a result of that consultation, which we did and we also brought in Indigenous community representatives from the other Melanesian countries, Papua New Guinea, Bougainville, New Caledonia, Fiji, Solomons. Once we'd done national consultations, we brought our people from national consultations to a meeting with all these people from other countries who've been working on the same issues in the same context, pretty much. I just want to refer to something here about where the domains of importance as a result of this consultation. And so basically there were three. One was, anyway, we came up with domains of value to people. So one was obviously access to the land for all the reasons we get from it. The other was being able to have the knowledge to use the resources from the land. So the traditional knowledge that allows you to use the land and its resources to have a life, sustain, have a culture, have a society, have a community. And the third one was the practices. So it's the land, the knowledge that allows the use of the land and the resources. And the third one was the practices that reinvigorate and transmit that knowledge from generation to generation. So rituals and certain other practices, even food obtaining strategies, stuff like that. Based on those very broad domains, we said these are what is important. These are the things that our communities value. And so how are we going to build these values into the way we collect data? The government collects statistics so that policies can be based on what people value rather than, GDP, blah, blah, blah. Simply the financial value. And so we worked on that for a long time. We had a guy come over who had been working in Bhutan in the National Happiness Index Institute, basically worked there, went over there worked for over a year on how they did it there. So we used that example. That was for us, that was a very clear example of where we wanted something like that. We wanted something like that. We wanted something like gross national happiness as something which became a predominant determinant of how we develop policies and how we develop in our country. And so sent someone over there to work for a long while, came back, continued to spearhead the move within our National Office of Statistics, did the first test surveys and censuses and household surveys in the normal way. In the normal way you develop a statistical set, right? So this is something I know nothing about, but this is what I've been told. Do the tests, the models, redefine it to the stage where we did the census, where we have a census every 10 years in Vanuatu, and the census that happened at the end of last year was the first time we collected data as part of a national census on these indicators. And these indicators include things like, obviously, how much customary land do you have free access to? And free access is the important thing. It's land that is yours. You own it under custom. You don't have to pay to use it. You have access to the resources. You govern it under your rules. How much land do you have access to? To what extent do you speak a religious language? To what extent do you have knowledge or have participated in traditional ceremonies? And then it even comes down to very basic things like what are the crops you grow and how long does it take you to get enough crops for the day's meals? And so you're trying to measure the traditional economy at the same time you're measuring all aspects of life, including the Western economy, which is measured obviously just by money. And so now we have, and if you're interested, you can go on the National Statistics Office Facebook page or website and see the well-being reports. So we've got very good data. Basically now we can say, okay, this kind of intervention will be good for generating money, but it will be bad in this area because the land available is not so much, so we can't do it here because it's not gonna, you're recognizing the importance of the traditional economy in certain areas as well. At the same time, around 6 years ago, we were developing our National Sustainable Development Plan. This is to align with the United Nations Decade of Sustainable Development, 2015 to 2030. We pushed to have our previous development plan scrapped because it was an ADB crafted thing that didn't really match with anything people wanted. And we developed ours from scratch. And we got our partner in that was IUCN. They came in with funding to help us look at these other factors that weren't traditionally looked at in terms of developing development plans for a state. And we did it in the same model we did all our other development of policy, which was going out to the communities, talking, getting their views, and then gradually bring it up to the sub-area, provincial level, and then national level, final consultations, and then develop the final policy. And so now since 2016, I think it was 16, we launched the Vanuatu National Sustainable Development Plan, which is the plan, the vision of the country from now until 2030, which is now only 9 years away. That vision is very much founded on, it's called the other name for the National Sustainable Development Plan is the People's Plan, because it was one of the first plans to be developed in this way from the bottom up. And it has the diagram of the plan is a house with 3 pillars and a floor, a foundation. And the pillars are economy, society, and environment. And the foundation is culture. Culture being values. What are our values as Ni Vanuatu people? Which are things I talked about, we worked about developing. So very much now we have a plan that, while it still talks about a Western style development in some aspects, it's also recognizing it has to be according to our values There has to be all the stuff about free, prior, informed consent of traditional owners to use of their land is as enshrined in the Constitution is all in there. And so we're trying to find I suppose we're trying to work towards a much better model for development for our country that recognizes our strengths in our traditional culture, in the way that the land is controlled by the communities according to their own rules. And the big issue always is the state, which I am part of, the Western state, bureaucratic state, which is the only form we know to govern a nation state in the current world order, right? There's nothing else. No one's done anything else. Maybe kingdoms. I know there's maybe some kingdom, maybe that's a different model, but apart from that, it's this Western democratic bureaucratic state. The big paradox we continually face and we have to find a way to deal with is the state is a parasite on the people, and it always will be. And it's all about extracting money from them, right? And that's all. It has to extract money to survive, and that's what taxes and everything's about. It's just about that. And so, the latest thing we're trying to do now, which we initiated back when we were in government in the last legislature, and it's now well underway, is strengthening, decentralizing, and strengthening local area councils, what we call local area councils. So trying to get a line, we have a colonial legacy of local government councils, which is what the British and French put in when they were here. So we have now devolved that down to using that model, which people are familiar with, but down to local area councils, which we have been in the process with the National Council of Chiefs of identifying customary areas. So custom areas meaning an area with the same culture and the same language. And what are the boundaries between them? People know that. So it's just a matter of going around and actually formally saying, okay, there's this customary, that's their names. Making the local area councils the same. So the governance unit that the government uses, the national government uses, which is the local government council, local area council, aligning it with the customary area, and then making the customary authorities the chairman of the local area council, and ensuring that you have women's rep, youth rep, business rep, rep of people with disabilities, church rep. Church is very important in Vanuatu. They sit on the local area council, and then the government starts to just give grants, and we give each local area council a civil servant full-time working with them, one at this stage. We're trying to assign more. Our party, the Land and Justice Party, that is our big policy agenda now, is decentralization through local area councils and empowering local area councils, making sure we strengthen that unit of governance, devolve state money down there so that people make decisions about what development projects happen in their areas, and they have the money from the government, from their own taxes to do it. And make it less top heavy, and make that become the unit of effective governance. And that's what people want. People want to be able to say what happens in their own areas according to their own values and their own priorities, and have the money from the government to do it, rather than the government dictate from up there. So I suppose that's the next stage along. But it's a work in progress. Obviously, we continue to do it. And I suppose what's different about our story is that we're a small country, and we were able to get into parliament to do it. We were able to take the reins of political power and do it. And I'm very much hoping that we will get into government again soon to continue to push this model to the next step. And I think I'll stop talking there. I'll give you time to ask questions.
Wow. Okay, that was a lot to take in. Let's open up to the circle here.
Hi, Raf. Rizlan here. So I'm working on Sabah's free, prior, informed consent guide. So I found that free, prior, informed consent is in your opinion, why the government is so reluctant of that term, free, prior, informed consent? Is that the reason that it's hard to do, or it's given no manpower to do it, or they just don't like the terms free, prior, informed consent? We in Sabah, I found that we talk a lot with the government. They don't like the term of free. So I would like to hear from you, what is your definition of free in the free prior informed consent, because they always said we don't need the free, we just need the prior informed consent, the PIC. But yeah, I found that they're really reluctant of the allergic with the term of the free term, and they said that we have FPIC, free prior informed consent, in our government institution, but I see that free prior informed consent is not really practiced 100%. They scattered all over all the department. The environmental protection department have their own terms of FPIC. The land and survey have their own term of FPIC, how they practice it, and that's not aligned with each other. So that's for me, it's make it difficult. And the idea was to create a whole like holistic guide for Sabah for free prior informed consent, but the government said that we already have that, but for me it's not aligned with each other. So that makes a lot of ineffective way to practice free prior informed consent, because different department definition is different from each department and how they practice it. And yeah, I just want to hear from you, what is your why the government body really doesn't like, I don't know, they don't like or they don't want to do it, and what is your view on the free term of free prior informed consent?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question, because that's a big issue for us. I think the first thing I want to say is it's important to keep using that term, because that is the term that has been decided by Indigenous people around the world. So even if they don't like it, that is the term we have to use all across the world, because that is the international term in international law, free prior informed consent. We do have a problem here in Vanuatu also with departments like, we did it with land in particular, but there are other departments like they don't use the same processes. But when it comes down to when talking about land leasing or determining land, the government has to go down to the community. That's the first thing. You meet in the community. You don't go to the office of the government. And that was a big change we did. The people no longer fill the forms up and the forms are sent up. No, the government has to come down, convene the meeting in the community context at the Nakamal. And everyone, and there's notice of it. There is a notice for a month before saying on this day, there's going to be a meeting to determine this land. Who is it's either going to be a meeting of the traditional authorities to decide according to customary law who the traditional owners are, or if the traditional owners have been determined and there is a lease application, it is a meeting of the traditional owners who have been identified to turn up and decide whether they want to lease. And that's the second one is where the free prior informed consent comes in, because the first one is using customary law. And FPIC doesn't necessarily apply in customary law, it often doesn't. But when it comes down to once the customer owners have been identified and there is an application to lease their land, the government has to come down to where the traditional owners meet and hold the meeting in their community. And that meeting is advertised for a month before it's on the radio, it's on the newspapers, it's on signs that are put up around the vicinity of that traditional area. And on that day, the government comes down, the officer comes down and presents the information about the application to lease, which has to be according to the law, it has to be in the Pidgin English language that everyone understands. It has to be read out because a lot of people can't read, so it has to be read out. This is what it is. And everyone's allowed, everyone who is a traditional owner identified according to customary law has a right to be there and should be there. And there is a mechanism if after the meeting happens, some of the traditional owners were not there, they have a mechanism where they can stop things happening until they're heard, their views are heard. So for example, and that stops something happening, which does happen sometimes in our communities, which is that the chiefs who are men will turn up to the meeting and a lot of the women won't be there, right? The women can then say, look, we are traditional owners too, we are part of the clan that's been identified as traditional owner. We were not there at the meeting. They have an avenue to then stop all proceedings on that lease and request that there be held another meeting be held where they are present. And this is presented to them again. But I think the important thing is it has to happen in the community. it's not, we reverse the whole process where you go up, you send forms up. In fact, the government comes down. And that's a way to make sure that you're there and you're with the people. And the publicity beforehand is a way of ensuring that it's free, right? Because people know that the meeting's happening and they can go if they want to. If they want to, they're free to go and sit there. And if they are the traditional owners, they can talk. When all that happens, and if they do approve a lease, according to certain terms, it goes up and then it's drafted. And then that lease has to be, once it's drafted, that lease has to be brought back down again in the same way back down to the community. There has to be notification, comes down. They go through the lease with the community, the actual paper lease, to get the final approval. So one reason governments don't like it is it takes a lot of time and money that the state has to put up, right? You could increase the fee though on whoever's wanting to lease. That's the solution. Especially if it's a large area, you can put a fee per area of land, right? So to pay for the process for the government. And that's something we had to look into. It's too costly, it's too time consuming. Put the fee back onto whoever's applying. It's a very, it goes against a lot of what's happening now. We're trying to reduce fees for business. No, it's increasing the fee to make them pay for the process. And notification in advance of things happening so that people can be there to give their views, and making sure that it's in a language they understand. That was all put in the law. So there's these various measures which were identified by the people. They were saying, we can't understand this. We need things written in our language we can understand. We need it read out to us. It needs to come down to us. And so we tried to basically put all that into the process where leases are get to receive free prior informed consent. And I must say that there's very few that have gone through that process, because when you talk about leasing land and you really understand what it means, a lot of people just don't do it. Now, if you're going to lose your land, access to your land for this, and there's not a lot of, we still haven't got the level of understanding in the community that a lease can be something that it gives power to both parties. And that's a matter of not enough information about what a lease instrument could possibly be, but that's another issue of resources. If we had enough resources, we'd run, training workshops for customer owners in how you can access and benefit share in proceeds from leases, or how you can set up a lease in a legal way so that you have access while the developing party does have access as well. But we haven't got the resources, so we just left all of that out. We don't do that. And which means communities have a lot less understanding of the options available to them by entering into leases, which inevitably means that a lot of the times they just refuse them, which, is a all right outcome. I hope that's given you some ideas. Thanks.
So were you able to enshrine FBIC in your national constitution? Is that what actually happened? There's a question here. Is it a law, for example, for government officers to go to the village?
No, it's in the law we just did in 2013. The constitution is much more broad. For example, it has a statement that says, customary law shall continue to have effect as the law of Vanuatu. And then another statement that says, land shall be owned according to customary law. So you have those broad statements, and unless you have the law which really defines it, it's really open to abuse. And that's what was happening. Even though the constitution has very good motherhood statements, it was being abused because people could just, the ministers could just go around without. So we were having to really define what it means to have customary law, land being held according to customary law. And what it meant was we had to change the constitution again to say the Supreme Court in a different chapter, which says the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of all disputes. It cannot be an arbiter for land disputes. And so we have to put a section in that says, notwithstanding what that section says, when it comes to ownership of customary land, customary law applies and not the Supreme Court. So yeah, it's the motherhood statements are good, but then it's the details, the devil's in the detail.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah. So my question will be a bit more general. First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Ralph. It was very, very enlightening, and I like some of your ideas, and I wish we could bring it to be implemented in Sabah at least. Not Malaysia, maybe, but at least Sabah. Okay, my question would be like this. This conflict or balancing act between what you call indigenous customary views, knowledge, laws, and so forth, maybe versus against universal laws. For example, do you have problem trying to balance, for example, universal human rights with respect to your so-called customary? Because sometimes people tend to think traditional customary laws and tradition tend to be more patriarchal and so forth. You know, they are not as wide and liberal as the Western way of looking at human rights and so forth. Do you have this problem when you are involved in making laws and so forth, and as you move towards what we call a more developed state? Thank you.
Yes, most definitely. In the Pacific, that is the key human rights issue, is that, I mean, the key human rights issue is actually domestic violence. That is the key human rights issue in the Pacific, is violence against, and I suppose, what do you call it? Yeah, bad attitudes to women and violence against women. But definitely customary law versus Western law, that's the big contradiction, is community benefit versus individual rights, right? And it is the key conflict you come across. And so I just want to give an example from the land laws, which we tried to put in place. Where I'll go back to the example of when traditional owners have been identified as a clan, right? Because land is held by clans or tribes normally, that will be the decision made that it's owned by this clan. And we've made it very, very clear in the law that when you come to talk about leasing land from that clan, and you come to get their free, prior, informed consent, every individual in that clan has the same legal right, women and children. And that may not be customary law, right? Customary law may be the men only can talk. But we've said, because we have a national constitution, we have a Bill of Rights, we're saying the customary law applies. It has identified the traditional customary owners as being this clan, but you cannot exclude the women from having a say. And that's why we set up a land ombudsman. And so if the women have been excluded from the meeting where the government comes down and meets with everybody, and unfortunately it's only the elders, men who turn up, or even if the women turn up, they tell them you can't talk. They can appeal to the land ombudsman and say, we were there, or we were not there, or we were there, but we couldn't speak and we couldn't express our views. And then the state has to make sure that you do have a right to express your views, because you are an unidentified customary owner. Even though under customary law, maybe you don't have the right to speak as freely. And so these are the things we're trying to find ways of accommodating when you're trying to facilitate customary law within the ambit of a Western constitution or state. And on that same issue, I want to also say that when it comes to custom, right, customary law, you've got to realize that we're in 2021, and our customary law is very different from what it was pre-European contact. And a lot of what we have now in our customary law is not traditional pre-European ways and values that we had then. It's stuff that's been influenced by Christianity, which is hugely patriarchal, by colonization. We were colonized by Britain and France, who were hugely patriarchal. For example, when the colonizers arrived in Vanuatu in the 1800s, it was all men, right? The men were the leaders, and they looked for men leaders in the community. And so in our communities, we had women's titling systems and grades, and you had men's, but the men's ones have been the ones that have been promoted by colonialism, and the women's ones suppressed. And so when we talk about traditional culture now, we think, oh no, it's the men who have this, but actually it's not. It's a result of colonization. So you've got to factor all that in as well into this whole discussion. And it's very hard to deal with that baggage sometimes, because people think this is the way it is, this is our tradition. And then it's only by doing that cultural heritage research and delving back into practices and that you start to realize that no, there's more of a story that's more nuanced than what we think it is.
Thank you very much. Just to add on, so that means the Council of Elders, isn't it? You have a Council of elders to negotiate with. So these members of the council do evolve and recognize there is this so-called openness of what you call customary laws and tradition. Yeah, would that happen? Is that happening?
No, not many of them. It's not elders. They're called chiefs. We have chiefs, and chiefs. One of the we are committed to, like our politics. We're committed to empowering traditional governance. And one of the big problems we're facing is, who are chiefs? Who are they? Chiefs are this thing we talk about. It's in our constitution, but there's all sorts of chiefs. I mean, people call me a chief sometimes, but you know, and that's a big issue. And if we are going to empower traditional governance within a Western constitution, we're going to have to identify these people. And identifying these people is going to open a whole can of worms, because there's all this historical baggage and stuff. And a lot of people say chiefs didn't even exist before colonization, because there were all other names for them. Like in our own communities, we have different names for different people with different sets of rights and responsibilities. But a lot of that nuance has now been lost. And now you have a community chief, right? And you have a council of chiefs for the community or the set of communities, which is a system that never existed before. It's contemporary Vanuatu, but it's not traditional. It's a kind of hybrid thing. And recognizing that culture is always changing, recognizing that there's a lot of value to these forms that have ancestral legacy, recognizing that these forms have all been influenced by colonization, westernization, education, capitalism, trying to find a way forward. And I think that's what we're trying to do. And we use these terms, and myself as a leader, I'm often, I think I'm engaged in social engineering, because I'm trying to steer things in a way that is better, in my view, for more sustainable development that's more inclusive.
Thank you very much for the explaining to me. Yes, I like it, because we will have probably the same type of problem if we move along this line, because we also have chieftains, Hogan South, and so forth, that we might have to negotiate, and who are the people who will be doing that job and so forth. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I think our compromise was make sure everyone is there. Like when there's a meeting of the clan, make sure everyone is there, and then they can argue it out, right? The chief can talk and the women can talk back, you know, but they're all have a right to be there and talk. Yeah.
On that note, can we hear from the other voices? Young ones, young leaders.
Raf, hi Raf.
Hi.
I'm particularly interested in how did the people of Vanuatu receive the gross domestic happiness as opposed to gross domestic product? Because as we know that in a capitalism world, the measurement of GDP, I mean, by shifting the measurement of success, we would know that to shift a community or its people towards a different direction as well. So how was the gross national happiness received in Vanuatu?
We knew that measuring land in terms of financial value was alienating our land, because it was being leased, because there was looking at very productive land that's supporting all these communities, and there's no money coming out of it. And so they were saying, we've got to lease it to make money. So we were looking for something that wasn't GDP as a way to measure value. And so we were looking for that. And Bhutan just shot out because it's the only one really doing it at that level. There was no other thing we knew of. And so suddenly we see there's this little country just like Vanuatu, very tiny, very, its ecology of very high integrity, people living very traditional lifestyles, and they've done this. And we were just like in awe, wow, there was this beacon of hope, and we couldn't see it anywhere else. So it was just like, it was like exactly what we wanted to do was that, and they were doing it. And so we really just grabbed onto that as something we could try to emulate. Yeah. So we were looking for something, and that was it. It was there. We were so lucky that it was there already.
Yeah, thank you. Was it well received by the government though?
Yeah, we thought that was amazing. It was amazing what Bhutan was doing. It was like it was what we wanted. It was a development based on our own values, self-determined, not this thing that had come from somewhere else,
I see.
Right. Okay, so the next question. After decades of Western colonization and capitalism, we do see its influence in activities that fuel people's beliefs and daily functions, more so in urban communities. How did these people receive the transition to reform into traditional customary laws and policies? Is there somewhat a middle ground?
Yes.
That's from
in Vanuatu, it's still, we're one of the countries where still the rural population is much greater than the urban population. But of course, the urban population is growing very fast, as everywhere. We still have more of a population in rural areas. But interestingly, the urban population relies on the traditional economy also, in that a lot of urban communities rely on their extended traditional kinship structures to maintain their living in an urban situation. They need that kinship to survive. They wouldn't survive without it, that extended family network that goes within the city, but also into back to the home communities. We also have a lot of urban people who rely on food being sent to them from the rural areas. Interestingly, it's not the other way around. It's people sending food on. So we have a lot of ships coming in from the islands with lots of food on it, which are for urban people to live on. But there is an emerging middle class, which is like I'm part of that, a new sort of Western educated, financially wealthy kind of class, which hasn't existed before the last 10 years, I would say. It's probably come into existence in the last 15 years. So this is a new phenomenon in my country. And for this new middle class, we need to be able to expand the land that is available for them to build homes, that kind of thing. And that means expanding urban boundaries, which means acquiring customary land. So something I didn't say at the beginning of my talk was that there is a process for acquiring customary land, making it state land. There are only two categories of land in Vanuatu. One is customary land and one is state land. And the state land is owned by the government in perpetuity, but it has to be first purchased from customary owners according to a process, the Land Acquisition Act, where you buy it according to market value, and then you buy it off the customary owners, it becomes state land. And then the government can then lease that as well. You can't sell it. The government can only lease it, same as the customary land. And so there's a process whereby you have to acquire land so it can become absorbed into the urban areas. And we've done very little of that. We've done a little bit, but more and more it's going to become something that we have to do to accommodate these new middle class, I suppose you could say.
I think I represent everyone here when we say thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Let's turn on those mics and just say thank you directly. Maybe show some love. some Borneo love.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ralph.
Thank you all. It's been an honor, and I
Thank you, Ralph.
hope that you guys do something amazing in your countries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Ralph. Thank you so much.
Totohuadan.